Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the conversation. Thank you for joining me. As usual, then let's begin by fixing our motivation. Trying to develop a positive mindset. And really, it's very much up to you to decide what is virtuous and non-virtuous. Of course, it's taught in a generalized way in all spiritual traditions. But we have to come to that understanding ourselves. What is ultimately positive? What is ultimately negative? What will bring about benefit? That sort of thing. And unless we develop some kind of personal conviction about our acts, then they will always be contrived. And so ultimately what we need is to gain certainty in our spiritual path. Now that's a really difficult thing to do, I understand. It's not easy to develop this kind of certainty. It's not even easy to understand what the main point is. But that's why we engage in these discussions. That's why we study the Dharma. That's why we investigate our own experience, how things arise to mind. And also we investigate or study communities and societies. These things are all helpful. In the end, then we have to come to understand the main point. We have to get down to the bottom of things. And in order to do that, then we need to study, contemplate and meditate. So I'm going to get straight into the questions. And Dharma Bird asks, where do you want your mindset to be before ordination, before you ordain? And actually that's very clear in the Buddha Dharma. Now, in general, then when we say ordain, then what we're talking about are the vows of personal liberation. These are the Pratamoksha vows. So I wonder, is somebody planning to be ordained, perhaps? So in general, it says that the vow cannot be received unless there are certain conditions, and principal among these is renunciation. And so even if you go through all the ceremonies, everything is correct, you're the right age, you have permission from your parents, all these kind of conditions that are set out in the Vinaya, then if you do not have the mindset of renunciation, then you do not receive the vows. And this is kind of interesting because there was a cousin of the Buddha who the Buddha had encouraged to take vows. And this cousin did not have the mindset of renunciation. So there's a big debate here. The debate is, well, he took the vows, but did he become a monk because he didn't have renunciation? What had happened is he had great attachment to his wife, or the woman he was betrothed to, let's say. In fact, it was his cousin. And so this Chungawa then could not have taken on the vows. In fact, he longed to be with his girlfriend or his partner. And it was a big problem for him because he naturally just had to do whatever the Buddha said. He was so in awe of the Buddha that when the Buddha suggested he become a monk, then of course he accepted immediately. But he still had great attachment to the world, especially to beauty and to his partner. So as the story goes then, he was continually trying to run away. Even after he took monk's robes, shaved his head, joined the Sangha, then whenever the Buddha went away to the village or went somewhere to teach, then Chungawa would try to escape. He would try to run away. But of course, then the Buddha is omniscient and could read his mind. And so somehow, whichever way he tried to run away, then he would bump into the Buddha and he'd be going, well, where are you going? And he'd be kind of embarrassed. And so the Buddha knew that he didn't have renunciation. It was all part of the plan, actually. See, what a Buddha has is this ability to see when beings are ready, when they're ripe. They're ripe for, let's say, arhatship, for liberation. And so the Buddha will always act in an appropriate manner. So the Buddha wasn't mistaken in asking his little cousin to become a monk. He could see that it was the right time. But at the same time, then Chungawa had great attachment to his girlfriend. And so he's running away. And at one point, then the Buddha said, look, let me take you on a little trip. And the Buddha tended to do this. He would sort of take people on these magical journeys. And what they did was, he would take my hand, and they went down to the hell realms. And the Buddha came down to the hell realms, and he said to, oh, Chungawa, you go have a look around. It's kind of funny, this story. So he went wandering around to see what was going on in hell. And he thought, wow, this is horrible. There's people being burned alive and things. And he came to this cavern deep under the earth, and he saw this boiling pot of water, but it had nobody in it. And there were these minions kind of leaning on their pitchforks, kind of, the sort of way road workers, when you're driving down the road, you see people repairing the road. They're all leaning on their shovels. So they're leaning there. And he said, well, what's going on here? I've been walking around in hell realms, and there's all these people being tortured and things. But there's this empty cauldron. And so he asked, why is that? He said, well, there's this monk. His name's Chungawa, and he kind of took vows, but he doesn't have renunciation, and so he's going to be born in hell, sort of thing. So basically, the Buddha gave him a reason to give rise to renunciation. And now what it's taught is that, or this is debated anyway. So some people say, well, of course he had renunciation when he took vows. And other people said, well, he didn't because he was attached to his girlfriend. And so the ones who debate that he didn't, they say, once he gave rise to renunciation, once he realized there was no happiness in samsara, then at that time, the vows matured in him and he became an authentic mendicant. So what we know from this story is that unless you have renunciation, then you can't take vows. So the answer to your question is very straightforward. The answer to that is, what do you need if you take vows? And remember, we're talking about the pratimoksha vows, the vows of personal liberation associated with the Theravada and the Hinayana tradition. Then you need renunciation. Now, in general, there are 3 levels of vows. There's the vows of pratimoksha, that's the vows of Hinayana. There's the bodhisattva vows, the vows of the Mahayana, and then there's the Vajrayana vows. But these Hinayana vows are the ones associated with people who take ordination and wear robes. So in general, that's what we're talking about. So is it the case that you have to take these vows of personal liberation, the pratimoksha vows? No. You can take the vows of the Mahayana and join the bodhisattva path, which does not involve becoming a monk. But what is taught is that even to take the bodhisattva vows, you also need renunciation. So what is renunciation? Well, renunciation is this firm belief that the mundane world, samsara, is nothing but suffering. As long as I have this body, these aggregates that are appropriated from my past misdeeds, then I'm going to encounter difficulty and suffering. And as I said in the previous video, then this kind of makes a lot of people depressed about the Bodhidharma. I think, oh, this is a difficult religion. It's like everything is suffering. I don't want to hear about suffering. I want to be happy. But this recognition that the mundane world is suffering is not depressing. It's actually liberating. Because along with that, there comes this belief that there is something called liberation or emancipation, and that we have something to work towards. And also this identification of the source of suffering means you have this way out of samsara. Once you understand why you suffer, and then there's a way of counteracting that. And I understand that it sounds difficult sometimes. It sounds difficult. Really, I should tell more of this story. I should tell the whole story. Go from the beginning. So here's Chungawa, and he was attached to his girlfriend. So the Buddha would take him on these little trips. So the first one he did was he took him to the top of like a snow mountain in the middle of nowhere, wilderness. And Chungawa was thinking, well, what's the Buddha taking me here for? And as they walked along, then there was this one-eyed ape, monkey or something, female one-eyed monkey who was really scabby and flea-bitten and looking pretty rough. And the Buddha said, who's more beautiful, your girlfriend or this monkey? So, and Chungawa went, well, of course, my girlfriend is really beautiful. It's amazing. It looks amazing. This monkey is absolutely horrible. And so he didn't understand what the Buddha was trying to talk about. So that was clear. I went back down to the earth. And then again, the Buddha encountered him when he was trying to run away. And this time he took him to the heavenly realms. And they said, oh, I'm going to take you to the heavenly realms. You can have a look around, go wander off and see what you can see. And so Chungawa went wandering around, and there's all these temples. And in every temple, well, not temple, sorry, this we call limitless palace. It's not called a temple. So it's like a, imperial palace or something, all made out of precious stones and metals. And inside, then there was a throne with somebody sitting on it, and they were surrounded by consorts, right? Well, in the text, it's gender specific, but I don't think it has to be gender specific. But basically, there's this somebody on a throne, could be a king or a queen, and they're surrounded by their lovers or consorts. And they're basically covered in silks with nice scented flowers, everything beautiful. And in the heavenly realms, the way it's described in the Buddha Dharma, these Deva realms, and they're just kind of immersed in bliss. It's like some massive opium trip or something like that. They're 24/7 there in this blissful state, and they've got everything they want. And he thought, wow, this is interesting. And so he wandered around a bit, and he found this palace that was empty. And they were all, again, there's all these consorts hanging around, kind of leaning on their elbows, waiting. And he said, what's going on here? And he said, and they said, well, there's this monk who's down in the earth. His name's Chungawa, and if he practices virtue, then he'll be born in heaven. And so Chungawa thought, wow, amazing. This is the result of practicing the vows and renunciation and practicing virtue. And so he met up with the Buddha again. They went back down to the earth. And Chungawa decided, well, that's it. Yeah, I'm on the path now. I'm going to apply myself. This world is nothing but suffering. Actually, I missed something. Sorry, I'm a bit sleep deprived this last week. So the Buddha asked him when he said, what did you see? Oh, I saw this palace. It was full of consorts. And the Buddha said, well, how do those consorts compare to your girlfriend? And Chungawa said, my girl's like that one-eyed monkey compared to these these goddesses. So basically, anyway, the story goes, I'm really messing it up today. But the way the story goes is that he was just so inspired by seeing all this beauty of heaven and all these beautiful girls, and because he had a lot of attachment, right, that when he came back down to the earth, he decided, that's it, I'm going to be a good monk. And so he applied himself diligently to his practice. But the Buddha said to the rest of the Sangha, he says, I don't want you guys to associate with Chungawa because he's on a different path than us. He's practicing just to be born in heaven. And this made Chungawa really upset because basically he would go to sit down and then everybody would get up and leave. So everybody was ignoring him. And it made him really, really, really unhappy. And so he went to the Buddha and said, look, nobody's talking to me. This is really depressing. And the Buddha said, look, come on, let's go on another trip. And that's when they went down to hell. And so he went down to hell. And he said, have a look around. And he went, he could see these different caverns and rooms with people being tortured, boiled alive. And they found this one cauldron that was empty. And the henchmen are standing around. And he asked, well, what are you waiting for? He said, well, there's this guy called Chungawa. And at the moment, he's practicing to be born in heaven. And then after he's born in heaven, what will happen is his good fortune or his good merit will run out. And when he's run out of his good virtue, his good karma, then he'll be born in this cauldron, and we're waiting for him. So this made Chungawa horrified, because he thought, well, even if I go to a heavenly realm, because I'm in samsara, then I'm going to circle continually, and eventually I'm going to end up being boiled alive. So there's no point. It doesn't matter how much pleasure or joy I experience in the heavenly realms, I'm going to be born in these unhappy states. Now, whether you see this to be kind of like it's a story, right, an analogy, but the message is very clear. And who's this message for? It's for us. Because this is very much the way we think on a kind of lesser degree. We have this feeling like temporary happiness is enough. And we kind of also think like, if I apply myself, then, my status will improve and things will work out all right. But what the Buddha taught is that it doesn't matter what pleasures you experience in the mundane world, excuse me, and then you will be reborn in lower states. You'll go up and down like a yo-yo, right? That's what the meaning of samsara is. It's this wheel, it just circles. And so these kind of temporary pleasures are meaningless. We kind of see temporary well-being and pleasure to be the ultimate goal and the most important thing. But the reality is that, they're ephemeral. They can't last. And that could be to a greater and lesser degree. And then there's like stories given within this lifetime to help people who don't really have a firm belief in past and future lives and reincarnation. For example, the stories of people who are become the richest man in the world, and then their whole world collapses, everything goes wrong, and they end up a beggar or a pauper. So there's many stories like that, you know, in our modern times. These aren't things you have to just have faith in from the ancient past. We see that people get to the peak of their kind of, you know, their career. They become really, really wealthy, and because of negative circumstances, they end up committing suicide or they die. I mean, look at all the oligarchs in Russia, for example, who were put into these positions in Gazprom and became multi-billionaires, and then they're found dead with their entire families. So there's just this sort of temporary happiness isn't good enough if you're on the spiritual path. So that's the muddled up and best answer I can give to you. What mindset do you need? You need renunciation. How do you develop renunciation? It's difficult, right? It's not easy in any way. Because again, we're kind of deceived. We're tricked by our temporary happiness. If we get a little bit of pleasure in this life, then that's kind of enough, you know. We've got a nice girlfriend, we've got an okay job, and we really like practicing the Dharma, but ultimately we're kind of happy with what we have. And that stops us from making progress. So somebody who has this kind of uncontrived renunciation is someone who's given up on the world. And they say that's what's needed to enter the door of the Dharma. So the path of accumulation, what delineates between someone who has not entered the path of accumulation, which is the start of the path, and someone who has entered, is that they have uncontrived renunciation. And that means that they will work for liberation. From this day onwards, once you get this renunciation, that's it. You're not going to be looking for temporary happiness. Of course, we fall back. You know, it happens a lot. When we continue to fall back until we gain liberation or the path of insight. And even arhats with remainder are said to be able to fall back into the mundane world temporarily. So it's quite difficult, and quite frankly, most of us don't develop renunciation. If we have it, it's temporary. It's not real renunciation. For example, we'll have something really horrible happen to us, and then we'll think, oh, life is so terrible. But the next day, things go right, you know, and we think, oh, yeah, everything's going okay today, and we kind of forget about the Dharma. Happy Monday, everyone. Hello, Jeanette. Hello, everyone. Okay, Matilda, yes, praise to everyone. Can you describe the various practices of householders and explain how they differ from monastic practices? So the Buddha specified this point, and it's often something that Westerners have difficulty with. What the Buddha said was that for householders, so you've heard of the 6 perfections, right? These 6 transcendent perfections, have you heard of them? You know, generosity, discipline, these sort of things, patience, etc. So the Buddha said that householders should engage in the first 2 of these, and that is generosity and discipline. And then many people think, well, that's strange. You know, I thought monks and nuns should devote themselves to discipline. But it's kind of misunderstanding what these 6 perfections are all about. So again, as we said, then somebody who needs to take vows should have renunciation, right? Your vow won't kind of mature. You won't receive the vow. That's the way it's talked about, unless you have that renunciation. So when you're taking your vows, you have to generate this feeling that samsara is nothing but suffering. And if that's there and all the other conditions are right, then you receive the vow. And the vow is actually seen to be something substantial. It's called imperceptible form. So it's a type of form. It falls into the aggregate of form. So that's how it's taught in the Hinayana anyway. And so the monastic then already has discipline. That's what they do. They develop renunciation. Based on that, they take their vows, and from that day onwards, they're keeping their vows. So they've sorted out discipline, right? And if you don't keep your vows, then you lose them, and you stop being a monk or a nun, and you go back to being a layperson, right? So what they say is that lay people should dedicate themselves to discipline and to generosity. And generosity is the first of the perfections. And that's difficult for Westerners because many Westerners think like, well, that's kind of a really low level of practice. I should be able to practice something much higher than that. And this is where we get to this point about the Vajrayana and these sort of ngakpas or mantrists. And so you'll see people who wear this is called a zen, right? This robe we wear, it's like a shawl, it's called a zen. And then there's these zens that are white and red. And that is kind of the symbol, the outward sign, what we call this kind of attire is what we call it. And it's red and white. It's got a white stripe in it. And that symbolizes that's the practice of a layperson. And it's associated with the Mantrayana. And so the general impression is that the lay practitioner is a Mantrayanist. And this is, many Westerners believe this. And so you'll go to teachings and you'll see a lot of people wearing this red and white zen, this red and white shawl. Now, strictly speaking, that shawl should be worn by somebody who's done a long retreat, a 3-year retreat. But I understand that many people will do that. And it's quite funny as well, because when you go to Dharma teachings in the East, like in the West, there's hardly any monks and nuns, right? So everybody's really comfortable with the way they're dressed. But when the Westerners travel to Nepal and India, and then they're surrounded like by 1,000 monks, they start feeling a bit uncomfortable. It's like the tables are turned, and they're like here in Parksville in Canada, I'm like an alien. But in Nepal, then lay people are like aliens. And so what they'll often do is they'll buy a shawl and wear a shawl, and it might just be blue or gray or something like that, or it might be one of these red and white ones. And it's because we're like sheep, right? We don't want to stand out in the crowd, so we want to sort of fit in, and they will wear the shawl. So anyway, I'm wandering off topic again. So what we do is we associate the Mantrayana practices with what should be practiced by a layperson. And the other thing is that most Westerners think that these Mantrayanists are much higher level than the monastics. That's the way Westerners tend to see it. Now, if you've gone to one of these gatherings like the Munlam, for example, so one year I was doing some work at the Munlam. I was doing the English announcement there, saying stuff over the loudspeaker. And there was a Ngakpa. So he was quite a famous teacher, say a Rinpoche, but he's a layperson. So he wore this kind of lay clothing or, this outward attire of a layperson, but a practitioner. And somebody said, why isn't he sitting with the rest of the monks and nuns? Because on the right-hand side of the stage, there was all the monks, and he was sitting over here with the people who were translating, and they thought that was a bit weird. And it was because that he wouldn't sit with them, because he would see it as being disrespectful. So in the East, then these people that we see as being the Mantrayanists feel like they need to show respect to the Sangha. So they put themselves in a lower position to the Sangha, but in the West, we think like once you graduate from being a monk, then you'll become a Mantrayanist and you can wear the white and red robe. So it's a kind of totally different way of thinking about things. But the point here is that this kind of Mantrayana or Vajrayana practice is not really what we would say is a layperson's practice. So when the Buddha made this distinction about how lay people should practice, for example, they should practice generosity and discipline, then the delineation there is between people who are working for a living. So lay people are people who have to they have children, right? In the olden days, you'd have children. Those children will work on your farm. They engage in commerce. They slaughter animals. They sort of do work to get by in the world. But these Mantrayanist retreatants, you could say, these practitioners, aren't really that kind of householder. They're people who are more like monks and nuns because they've dedicated their whole life to practice. And so they don't engage in worldly work and slaughtering animals. Look at Chatrao Rinpoche, for example. He was a layperson in terms of he didn't have monastic vows, but he was a Mantrayana practitioner and one of the few authentic Vajrayana or Mantrayana practitioners of the modern era. And he also had a consort, which is quite common. But it's not like he was, somebody running a household, for example, paying his taxes, going to work to feed his family, and that sort of thing. he was 100% religious person. In fact, he spent most of his time wandering around the mountains, meditating. So that's where we have a difficulty with this, because we think about lay people as somebody who can have a girlfriend or isn't a monk. And then monks, people who don't have girlfriends and, wear monastic robes. But really, that's not the division that the Buddha was talking about. It's about people who didn't have the good karma to escape mundane activity just to get by. And it's a bit difficult in the West. It's easier if you go to a place like Nepal, because there you can see how villagers and lay people actually have to work to survive and get by. And in the West, we've kind of lost this. We have social security. Our kind of the way we can get by and live is very different. I mean, you could be a kind of influencer on YouTube and just talk to a camera all day. And that's not really what a kind of villager from Nepal would think about as being earning a living, right? Because for them, they're digging in the earth. They're slaughtering animals, family members dying. They can't afford medicine. It's all that kind of thing. So the differentiation in the ancient world was that these people are just struggling to survive, and that takes up all their time. This is the important thing. It's not about being a sangha in this term. Isn't about being a monk or a nun, or not being a monk or a nun. It's whether or not you've made that leap. This is it. I'm going to dedicate myself wholeheartedly to the Dharma. The number one thing is the Buddha Dharma or the spiritual path, whatever religion you're involved in. And so in the Hindu tradition, we see these guys, they wear white or yellow kind of cloth, like a loincloth and a wrap, and they go around begging. They've given up mundane life to dedicate themselves to the spiritual path. So then if we sort of frame the question in that context, then the answer becomes very different in terms of describing the various practices of householders, because there are many. But in general, there aren't significant differences between the practices of monks and lay people in this regard. I don't mean the householders who are just struggling to get by every day, because really they only have time to light a candle, give a bit of money to a monk, or give food to a monk or something like that. They don't have time in their life to really practice. But in the modern world, then all of the Mahayana practices, bodhicitta, right, those sort of things, tonglen, giving and taking, meditation practices, those are open and they're the same between monks and nuns. The one thing that is very different is these practices that involve deity union. So these kind of, you could call them sexual practices or something like that. If you read Jamgon Kongtrul's text called The Three Vows, then he's very specific there. He talks about all the different types of practices, and it's really only in this area, right, that the monastic can't participate in what a layperson would, because that layperson doesn't have vows. In the ancient world, it was a little bit different, because they were more strict about their discipline, right? So the monks and nuns had to beg for their food, for example. And so there was a bit of a difficulty there, because if a monk or a nun goes off to practice in the mountain, then they might have to prepare their own food, right? There's nobody to beg from, etc. And so there are all these provisions, and there's a type of monks that live in monasteries, in the forest, who live in the mountains in retreat, etc. And then there's some allowances made there. And so anyway, why I'm saying that is because there were certain things, for example, that a monastic couldn't really do. And I'm not talking about the ones involving kind of sexual interaction, etc., because of the way they lived, and they used to live much more strictly to their vows. And so we kind of do it in what are called yarne. They've got these summer retreats. So there are these 2 periods of the year where the monks go into sort of seclusion, and their vows are kind of more strict. They keep the vows more strictly. But in the past, then, they used to keep the vows, they used to keep the vows much more strictly. And I kind of thought that the Theravadins and the Hinayana practitioners were, so much better at keeping vows than we were in the Tibetan tradition. For example, they make a point of not eating in the evening, in the afternoon, whereas the Tibetans, almost all of them eat in the afternoon. so I assume that they're much more strict in this regard. But I did visit Theravada temple recently, and I went into the tea room to talk to some of the monks because I wanted to, get to know them and what they do. And I noticed that most of them were actually eating, but they would eat like a little bit of cheese or something like that. And I think this is funny. This comes from the Vinaya, because there's this sort of thing where you're allowed to have a glass of milk, but not sort of curds like yogurt kind of thing. So maybe this has some slight bending of the rules where, the milk is kind of a bit more solid than it should be or something like that. So really, what I'm saying is these days, we don't keep our vows that strictly. And so, for example, if I wanted to engage in Vajrayana practice, this sort of practicing with consort that's so famous, then I would have to basically give my vows back in order to do that. And that is something that is generally accepted by all Tibetan Buddhists. However, having said that, then we get this kind of bad name, or people have this impression that the Tibetans are very loose with their vows and that they kind of don't follow this, that they have girlfriends and things like that. But I think this is a misconception, because you'll see a lot of people who wear what look like monastic robes, but they're not actually monastics. So there's this Nzonso Khenche Rinpoche, and he looks like a monk, right? But he's not actually a monk. He's a lay person with vows. And so how you can tell usually is that they have a kind of skirt, but they might grow their hair, and then they don't wear a tonga, so this kind of top thing on top. But so it's not really that they're just disobeying their vows. It's that a lot of the monks aren't fully ordained monks. And as we know then in the Zen tradition, then it's not all of the monks, but some of the monks and nuns get married. But really they are real householders. So they have a house, and they have family and children, and they do all the stuff like you have to do to have a family in the olden days, like keep animals and farm and that sort of stuff. We're not supposed to farm and those sort of things. But they have like a family temple, and they kind of manage the temple, and people come there to pray. But that's in the Japanese tradition, and it's only within a particular sect. It's not totally widespread. But in general, then in the Tibetan tradition, then they don't get married. But I have to say, there are actually a lot of really naughty Tibetan Rinpoches and Lamas and things, and they have all kinds of girlfriends, and they are monastics. It does happen. So that would be the most clear delineation. But in terms of the actual practice, then when it comes to doing, let's say, Vajrayana practices, right? These sadhanas, deity visualization, mantra practices, all the different kinds of shine. If you want to do Mahamudra, you want to do Dzogchen, those are all open to anybody. They're open to lay people in terms of people who haven't got monastic vows, and they're open to monastics. There's no difference there. As I said, the only difference would be we're not allowed to, for example, use alcohol as a focus for our meditation, but the mantrists use it, and we're not allowed to use a consort as a monastic, but the lay people are able to do that. So it's really only these principal vows that you have to be, you can say that there's a difference. But if you're a busy person, so again, the question could be slightly different. So you're somebody who's got a job, living in the world, and you have to work every day, maybe 6 hours, 8 hours. Some people are able to do just half a day. Then you kind of have to find a practice that you can fit into your schedule. And for a lot of people in the West, that's a Vajrayana practice. That's some kind of, let's say, Vajrasattva, where you visualize a deity, some kind of Vajrayana practice many people use. And that works fine. I mean, there's this guy, Karma Choga, is staying at my retreat at the moment. The retreat's not functioning, but there's somewhere to live, and I want somebody there meditating as much as possible. And what he does is he does a job in the summer, which is fire watch. So, we get a lot of fires in Canada. He goes off and he sits in a watchtower and it does fire watch. And of course, there's not a lot of work to do, so he can meditate when he does that, and he gets quite good money. And then he saves out that money, and in winter, then he doesn't have to work, and he can just meditate all the time. So there's lots of that going on, right, in the world, where we've got to kind of make our mundane life and our spiritual life work together. Now, this is a big topic, because we have this feeling like we don't have to abandon the mundane life, and we can kind of make our mundane life and our spiritual life work together. And if you look at what was taught in the old text, then they say that this is generally a trap. That's really dangerous. How can that work for you? Well, if you develop this feeling that the spiritual path is the number one most important thing, if you have that, then you can fit in a working life. If you have that as the main thing. But if the worldly life is the main thing, the most important concern in your life, then the Dharma, the spiritual part, will always just be a hobby. Will it benefit you? Yes, it's beneficial. It will help you to be a calmer person. It will help you to be kinder to your colleagues, your partners, your family. It will make the world a better place in mundane terms, but it will be very difficult to make sort of spiritual progress. And when I say that, I mean progress in terms of gaining liberation. A lot of what liberation is about is developing this renunciation, feeling like the mundane world has got unsolvable issues with it. There's no way I can fix that. And so I must find something else. And then you just kind of tolerate the mundane world in order to reach your spiritual goals. So if you've got a busy life, then you can take on a Vajrayana practice, even if that's something just like Tara or Chenrezig or Vajrasattva. And there's more complex versions of those. You can practice a type of Mahamudra practice. I use that term loosely, but if you look at Mingyur Rinpoche and Taisiddha Rinpoche, they all offer these courses on Mahamudra for lay people, basically. They're aimed at lay people. And it gives you a kind of schedule of 2 hours a day of meditation. And it's mostly Shine. It's only when you get to 6th year or something like that, you start really getting into the actual instructions. But still, it's damn good. It's one of the best things you can do as a layperson, because for most people, all they can manage if they've got a working life is 2 hours a day. And then these are really powerful and really authentic teachings. And I would recommend anybody in the mundane world to take one of those courses. Bit of a problem because you have to travel to Delhi in India. In some ways it's more effective. It's a more effective use of time because all the students come to one place and then they can dedicate more time to the practice and the teaching. Whereas if the Lama or the Rinpoche travels around the world, then you only get like a weekend, right? Everywhere he goes, 1 weekend here, 1 weekend there, 1 weekend there. So it takes several years to do 1 year of teaching. So that's an option. Also there's Goenka, the Vipassana method that was started by Goenka, the teacher. Of course, Goenka has passed on, but it's everywhere in the world, there's Vipassana. What they do is 10-day silent retreats, and then you take that practice home, and you'll do your own practice at home. It's basically Shine, it's not really Vipassana, but that's also a very effective practice, and it was specifically developed for people with mundane jobs and worldly life. But again, as I said, in the modern world, we have a lot more options, in the West anyway, we have a lot more options for getting by. We can become a digital nomad, for example. If you're good with computers, you can become a digital nomad. Forget about living in the West. You can go to India, receive teachings from the Dalai Lama, Taisiddha Rinpoche, Sanjay Nimpa Rinpoche. You can travel around, Sonsor Rinpoche. You can go to the East and do all your work online. So we've got more kind of creative methods for being a layperson now. And so if you get a chance, travel to Africa or to Nepal, and then you can see, oh, that's what they mean by a layperson in the old Buddha Dharma. Somebody who's all their time is taken up by just getting by, right? Subsistence farming, takes up all day long, every day. All you've got is enough time to offer a little bit of incense to the temple and give a bit of food to a monk. Okay, let's move on. Bows with gratitude, everybody. Greetings, Venerable. I'm not sure how venerable I am, but I'll try my best. Can you elaborate on the Bodhisattva vows? Yeah, so they will be given at Nalanda during Munlam, and I'm thinking of taking them. Definitely worthwhile doing. The Bodhisattva vow is something that no one needs to worry about. There's a couple of reasons. Again, I mentioned this text called the Three Vows, written by Jamgon Kongtrul Rinpoche, that specifies the differences between the Pracha-moksha vows, the Bodhisattva vows, and the Vajrayana vows. So now we're talking about these middle level of vows. The first part of the conversation was about this ordination vows. The vows of personal liberation. Don't kill, don't steal, don't engage in sexual misconduct, right? Don't tell spiritual lies, don't drink alcohol, the principal vows, those sort of things. The Bodhisattva vow is a commitment to work for the benefit of beings. But it's not just mundane benefit, it's ultimate benefit. So we've got this prayer that you may be familiar with. It's like Sonje Chotan, Soje Chonan, Changchung Bardo, Dani, Chomsun, etc., etc. And so what we're doing there is we're making a commitment. This is actually the Bodhisattva vow itself. We're making a commitment to seek enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. And that means to establish all sentient beings in the state of a thoroughly enlightened Buddha. So there's two aspects. There's the aspect of self-benefit and other benefit. The self-benefit side, or the Dharmakaya, is that I myself must become a fully enlightened being. And the other benefit is to establish all sentient beings in that same exalted state. And that's basically what it's all about. And the principal vow in the Bodhisattva vows, I mean, it's, if you look at Gampopa's text, Jewel Ornament of Liberation, it lays it out all very specifically. And maybe I'll do a video on that. But the principal one is never to abandon a sentient being. This is it. What does it mean to abandon a sentient being? Well, it doesn't mean leaving your mate at the bus stop when you go out in the evening. It doesn't mean that. It means, let's say somebody does something really horrible to you. They really con you, trick you, do something really horrible. I don't know, steal your money, steal your car, trick you in business, steal your girlfriend, something like that. And then you think, oh, that guy, I'm never going, if I get the chance to help them, to establish them on the Buddha path in the future, forget it. We're done. If you do that, then you've lost your Bodhisattva vow. That's the principal vow. Now, it sounds bad. It's like, oh, I've lost my vows. It's like I lose my monk's vows. That's it. I'm finished. It's not like that. And it's because the Bodhisattva vow is something that we retake every time we do a meditation session. So a Bodhisattva vow is something that we refresh all the time. And not only that, it can be refreshed or retaken without any specific ceremony. They say that you can retake your Bodhisattva vow merely by imagining a Buddha or looking at a Buddha statue and making this commitment to that. So it's something that, one, isn't dangerous to take. You should never have second thoughts about it. There's no dangerous samaya associated with it. Samaya is a sacred commitment. And even if you lose it, then you can retake it. It's kind of a very transparent, very pure kind of vow. So I've often told the story in the past. It's about, I don't know what that is. Somebody's ringing me. So I told this story in the past about Lord Atisha regarding the three vows. And Lord Atisha famously said that I took my Pratimoksha vows and I've never had the slightest stain. So I never had any infringement on my my Pratimoksha vows or my monastic vows. When it came to the this sort of Bodhisattva vows, then there was the occasional occasional kind of failure from time to time. But I always remember to repair it and retake the vow. So repairing it is to give rise to regret and then to say, oh, I'm going to take the vow again. And then he said, in terms of the Vajrayana, then the faults and downfalls were just like snow in a blizzard. So what he's saying there is that the Vajrayana vows are the most difficult to keep. So what is the principal Vajrayana vow? That is pure vision, But pure vision isn't what we think it is. We think pure vision is just to say, everybody is God, everybody is Buddha, everything is pure, there is no good and bad. That's got nothing to do with pure vision. Pure vision has to do with maintaining the actual view of purity. It's not just trying to convince yourself that there is no duality, to say the words. It's actually to perceive the world in that way. And that's what the Vajrayana practices are about. We meditate on all these deities, right? In palaces, in union, everything is like rainbow light. Well, it's not about kind of being hypnotized or, convincing yourself that that's the way you see reality. It's about actually perceiving reality that way. So for us, when we walk down the street and we see some dog poop on the road, we think, ugh, filthy dog poop. Lost your Vajrayana vow immediately. Because our natural instinct is to judge that as being something negative. We have a very strong sense of good and bad. So in comparison to the Vajrayana vow, then the Bodhisattva vow is much better. The Bodhisattva vow, this bodhicitta, or relative bodhicitta, is divided into two. There is aspirational bodhicitta, and there's application. There's this applicational, can you say? The bodhicitta of application and the bodhicitta of aspiration. And so even if we just have the aspirational bodhicitta, then that's the starting point. That's enough for us to engage or to keep our bodhicitta vows, or bodhisattva vows. So aspiration is like, well, tomorrow I've got to go to Costco and do some shopping for my parents. It's this plan to do it. Application is actually going there and doing the shopping, buying some food for your parents, right? That's the difference between this aspirational and this bodhicitta of application. And so to be able to give rise to the thought, I must seek liberation in order to benefit all sentient beings, that's something we're able to do, right? It's something we're able to keep. Of course, we will get angry, we will forget it. Sometimes we will engage in misdeeds, but in terms of the bodhisattva vow, none of that matters. The important thing is that we work towards developing this aspiration to benefit all sentient beings. That's really what the vow is all about. Ultimately, what we need is ultimate bodhicitta. So there's relative bodhicitta and there's ultimate bodhicitta. Relative bodhicitta has the bodhicitta of aspiration and the bodhicitta of application. Ultimate bodhicitta is the same as the view of the Vajrayana. It's Mahamudra. It's this Dharmakaya. It's this ultimate thing that is not accessible to ordinary beings. So that's really difficult. But relative bodhicitta is the direct cause for the development of ultimate bodhicitta. So as long as we work at relative bodhicitta, and relative bodhicitta is this wish to benefit all beings, and also the application of that, then we're on the right path. So as you can see, it's not something that's kind of fraught with danger, and it's something we can apply ourselves to, because relative bodhicitta is quite easy. We can see a little bird with a broken wing, and we can give rise to love and compassion for that animal, even a small insect, right? And then we can also use the basis of our natural love and compassion for our own children, our mother and our parents, etc., and spread that out to the rest of humanity, and then also animals and spirits and ghosts and whatever hell beings. So it's something we're able to develop and work on. And as long as we have that aspiration, then we're kind of on the right path. What is application? Well, the application is what I was talking about earlier, and that's the 6 paramitas, the 6 transcendent perfections, right? So that's the actual application of it. Generosity, discipline, patience, diligence, right? This, what we call concentration, and ultimately what we're looking for is wisdom. These transcendent 6 perfections. Also, it's sometimes thought that there's 10. Yeah, there will be given at Nalanda during the Munlam. Yes, I suggest that there's no danger in you participating in the Bodhisattva vow. In fact, I would encourage anybody to do that. I wouldn't encourage anybody to take monastic vows. I would say that you have to think about it a lot before you make that commitment. There's a problem in the West generally. We see that the monastic vows to be the most difficult and the Vajrayana vows to be the least difficult. And that's kind of the way we are, because the world is opposite to the spiritual path. So we see everything backwards. Actually, the Vajrayana vows are the most difficult to keep, and the monastic vows are the easiest to keep. Because the Vajrayana vows, you have to have pure vision, right? But what's quite clear is we don't have control over our minds, right? I can stop myself from killing a human being, no problem. So we've got these 5 principal vows, right? Don't kill, don't steal, don't engage in spiritual lies or sexual misconduct, don't drink. I can very easily not kill somebody, you know? I can easily go through my life and not even do that accidentally. So that's quite simple. But if somebody insults me or punches me in the face, it's very difficult for me to retain pure vision. In fact, I don't even have pure vision to start with. So how am I going to retain it? Very difficult. And so in the middle there, the sort of second most difficult, or the middling one, is the Bodhisattva vow. But again, with the Bodhisattva vow, then you're not restricted in your conduct so much. So when you're a layperson and you've got to live in the world, then it's difficult for you to keep your monastic vows. The Bodhisattva vow is probably easier than the other 2 in that regard. Blessing, Miguel. Would you suggest studying Korean branch of Zen Buddhism based on Chunil teachings? So I think the Son, it's called Son Buddhism. My grandmother was a Son Buddhist, and most Koreans are associated with Son Buddhism. And I would suggest that it's very authentic, but to actually study it is difficult. There was a time, I think in the late 70s, when they accepted Westerners into the Korean Sangha very easily. And then what they found is like a lot of Westerners would join, but they weren't very serious and they would kind of drop out after a few years. And so they made it much more strict. And so after that, then what you need to do is you had to study Hangul, which is a special language. It's not really, it's kind of Korean, but it's using ancient script. It's derived from Chinese pictographs, glyphs. And then these have Korean meaning. So it's like a special language that you could say the Korean canon is written in. It's like the Korean Bible. So then after that, they said, well, you have to learn this language and you also have to memorize a few sutras. And now, as far as I understand, they've got even more strict. And you have to actually get a degree, a university degree. And I suppose that's in Buddhist philosophy or something like that. So to receive authentic Korean Son teachings is going to be very difficult. To go to a Korean temple and get some basic meditation instructions is not difficult. It's easier to get Zen instructions from the Japanese tradition because it proliferated in the West a lot. Part of the reason why Japanese Zen Buddhism proliferated in the West a lot is because many teachers, for example, like Suzuki, basically left Japan because the religion is finished there. More or less. The monasteries are empty, there's very few monks and nuns, and the lay people really only expect the monks and nuns to do things like wedding ceremonies and death rites and things like that. So Suzuki, because he was into meditation, decided to move to the West because he really didn't see any spiritual significance for his remaining in Japan. And the branch of study in Japan, I think, also has really drastically declined. Maybe it's only being revived in the West. There are people studying. But in terms of the Korean Son Buddhism, then it's very strong. Their education is really excellent, and they're also very diligent. But like if you want to take vows in the Korean and also in the Chinese tradition now, I think, then you have to memorize the entire the Vinaya root text. So you have to have that to memory and you'll be tested on it. And also, in the Thai forest tradition as well, they test you. You have to study and you have to memorize things. So to get actual Son teachings is difficult. And then a lot of what they do is they study primarily sutra, right? In the Tibetan Buddhism, we focus mainly on treaties. So we look at the works of Chandrakirti, Nagarjuna, this sort of stuff, Aryadeva, all these principal texts written by Panditas that explain the meaning of the sutras. But in many Buddhist traditions, what they do is they just memorize the sutras. It's slightly different. There are a lot of treatises and commentaries in the Korean language, but I think it's quite difficult to find these in the English language. So again, as I said, to get an actual authentic education in Korean Buddhism is quite difficult. And it's more difficult to get instructions in meditation in Korean Buddhism. I don't know what it's like locally, like maybe in LA, there's a Korean Son Center that gives basic Zen sitting meditation practices. But what I've encountered in this tradition is that they don't accept people in easily because they see them to be kind of not serious about what they're doing. So they're quite strict about that. And they're quite closed off as well. If you go to Dharmasala, that's where the Dalai Lama is, then many Koreans request teachings from the Dalai Lama, but 95% of them are nuns. You hardly ever get the actual monks coming. There's a few, one or two, and that's because they're kind of not accepting or not open to this sort of mixing things up. They're very kind of kosher, and traditional about what they do. But again, it's quite likely that you can get some level of education in Korean Buddhism, and as I said, to my mind, it's very authentic. They actually have, as far as I know, they actually have Vajrayana teachings in the Korean tradition as well. But they're better than we are in the Tibetan tradition because they've remained secret. so it's not publicly known, but this is what I've heard, insider information, is that it has remained, but it's never ever taught publicly. It's only one-to-one on a secret basis with the teacher, which is the way it should have been, remained. It's part of the reason why the Vajrayana tradition is in decline. So I will be going, I have to take my dad, there's something called this Chuseok in Korea, which is where you visit the graves of your ancestors. And my father's getting very old, and this could be his last year. And so he's decided to make one more trip to go see our ancestors' graves. And so it looks like I will be sort of accompanying him, because he needs somebody to help him. And if I do, then I'm going to visit a few places and probably stay in a monastery there. And so I'll get some more kind of clear information about what's going on in the Korean tradition, sort of firsthand. And I'll try to speak to some monks and nuns there and get a feel for what things are like, because obviously I've been out of action in the West for 13 years in retreat. But as far as I remember, 13 years ago, then they were becoming more strict. There was this branch of, it's called the laity branch. It's quite new in Korean Buddhism. That opens up to lay practitioners. And I think it's helped the spread of Korean Buddhism. And on the basis of that, then they are teaching publicly to lay people. In fact, last time I went to Korea, I noticed that there was always a monk there with a kind of, karaoke machine or something, giving teachings all the time. And previously, when I was young and I traveled in Korea, then I never saw that. The monastery is mostly empty. But now there's quite a lot of, they're always teaching, and there's a lot of people listening to their teaching, but they're mainly women. There's very few men. It's the same in China. In our retreat center, we've got loads of Chinese nuns, but not a single Chinese monk. We have a Korean monk. We have 2 Korean monks, no Chinese ones. So yes, I think it's a great idea to study Korean Buddhism. And you probably know more about what's available now in the English language in the West than I do. To get into the depths of what they teach, and Korean Buddhism is very profound, and also there are many very skilled and kind of accomplished meditators in the Korean tradition, as far as I understand, but you don't meet them. They're very secretive about what they do. So ultimately there is a very valid path for liberation there. But to get into that, you have to be damn dedicated and very, very sincere. Otherwise, it'll be much the same as most of what we study in the Buddha Dharma. It's kind of hobby level. What is the difference between empty space you can focus on in shamatha and an object of meditation, and emptiness as in the unborn nature? So empty space and emptiness are not synonymous in any way. And in terms of objects of meditation, in terms of shamatha, and this is related to what I was talking about, these practices that you will get from Taisito Rinpoche and Mingyu Rinpoche, these preparations for Mahamudra, is the coarseness or subtlety of the object. So in terms of shamatha objects, we've got real objects. We don't believe things are real, right? But in terms of real objects, then we've got things like, let's say there's a coin here, a little round coin or something like that, or a stone, or a candle. Then there's difference in subtlety. So a stone is one of the most coarse objects. And the stone, you could say earth element, also includes metals and things like that. And elementally, then that is more coarse than, for example, water, right? Water is more subtle. And then wind, this fire is more subtle, and wind is more subtle. And then space, this meditation on space, is the most subtle of these kind of real objects in terms of external objects that arise to the sense perceptions. So when you choose a meditation object, you have to choose something, well, some people say you should choose something that you like. Now there's danger there, because if you just kind of pander to your likes and dislikes, it can be quite negative. So sometimes you have to kind of live with something you don't like. But yes, if you have interest in your object, then that's good. So you've got these real outer objects, and there's the elements, stone, water, wind, fire, space, etc. And the empty space is a much more subtle object. What does that mean? It's more difficult to hold the mind on a subtle object. So a stone is really stable. It doesn't change. It just sits there. To us, it feels like it's unchanging and permanent. And also because of the earth element, it's very grounding. So this is like an anchor for your mind, right? But when you try to meditate on even let's say a flame or a candle, then a flame is kind of ephemeral. It's always changing. So it doesn't have this this nature of being kind of solid and stable. And then with wind, normally you look like a flag or something like that, or you could see the smoke of the incense blowing in the wind. Again, that's subtle, right? It's more subtle than a stone. And even water is more subtle than a stone. It's kind of transparent or translucent. And so the mind isn't held so easily. And that's a difference of the subtlety. Now you can have outer objects that have other significance, like meaning. Like a Buddha statue or something, let's say this Vajra, is made out of metal, so you could say that's like an earth element, but also it has kind of spiritual significance. So we see, if you have a kind of Buddhist view, then we see this Vajra to be something sacred, or a statue of a sacred. A statue of a Buddha is like sacred to us. So this is the way we classify the objects. And generally we start with the most coarse and most subtle, and that's like earth element, a stone. And by doing that, then we develop this very stable mind. And then what we do as we gain kind of this ability to hold the mind on a very coarse object that is unmoving, then we move to a more subtle one. And we progress in stages like that in order to develop mental stability. So initially, if you go straight to try to meditate on empty space, it can be very hard to hold the mind and you may not make progress. So in many ways, and this is especially in our tradition and the Kagyu Mahamudra tradition, then we work very systematically with our objects. Now what you should do is, once you've kind of mastered the ability to hold the mind on a stable, coarse outer object, then you really should move to a more subtle one. And that way develop your skill. And eventually you can meditate on space. And likewise, a mental object can be used, visualization. But again, a visualization is very difficult because in order to generate a visualization, we have to already have mental stability. So we can imagine a Buddha or green Torah. And what we normally find is that it's very unstable. It's hard even to see a visualization. It might be that you meditate for months and months and months and not even have a visual image in your mind, and it could just pop up for an instant. So as you can see, there's a great difference here. Now in terms of emptiness, then emptiness is the nature of all phenomena. So space is seen to be one of these kind of elements, right? These primary elements: earth, water, fire, wind, and space, etc. And it's a bit difficult because in the Buddha Dharma we talk about uncompounded space as being a non-composite phenomena. And that kind of contradicts modern discovery, where we see space to interact with composite phenomena. So there's a little bit of a difficulty there. But anyway, that leaving that aside, that notwithstanding, then emptiness is the way things abide, this unborn nature. This is the way everything is. And it's the ultimate goal. Understanding this or developing this insight is our ultimate goal in meditation. Somebody who has realized emptiness has basically reached this level of insight, liberation from samsara. Somebody who has realized emptiness no longer suffers from physical pain, etc., mental pain, because they've realized the unborn nature of things. And it's not in any way related to empty space. Empty space is something you could say that appears to mind. Maybe we conceptually grasp empty space, but I can look, for example, in this room. I don't see the air, but I can be aware of this space that is in front of me. The space of a basketball or something like that in front of me. I can be aware of that, but it's not a real or tangible thing. So it's subtle, but that's got nothing to do with the nature of emptiness. The term emptiness means kind of voidness. It's a tongba ni, right? Tongba means void or empty, devoid. It's a negation. And ni is like essence. It's this essential particle, word particle in the Tibetan language. So really it doesn't mean nothing. It means the nature of voidness. So it can be translated as voidness. Now, what we need to do is come to understand this. And how do we come to understand or realize emptiness? Well, that is through contemplating impermanence. So there is coarse impermanence and there's subtle impermanence. Coarse impermanence is something that we all understand. One day I will die. That's a conceptual understanding that nothing lasts. We can see an object like this coin, for example, and although it seems to be unchanging, then conceptually we can understand that it will rust and eventually it will turn into oxide. It will completely disappear. It's being a coin in metal. This identity will be lost. And this is really what emptiness has to do with. What are we lacking? We're lacking self. What does lacking self mean? It means lacking identity. And so at the moment, we identify this as being money. It's a coin. It's a Canadian quarter. And to us, it seems like a real thing. But as we understand, then it's not only is its nature at the moment not solid, it's made of small particles and mostly space held together by kind of forces, but not only that, it's continually changing, and eventually it will lose its identity. So if something doesn't have a fixed identity, a permanent identity, then it's said to be lacking self, no self. This is the truth of emptiness. It applies to everything. It applies to emptiness itself. Emptiness itself is empty of nature. So it's not a thing. It's the unborn state of reality. And how do we relate to that? Well, it is the only thing that we actually experience. But we don't understand that. And that's because our world, the world that we perceive, is one that we have fabricated out of our conceptual imputations, right? We have past, present, and future moments of experience. And these past moments do not exist. But we only relate to the present moment, in relationship to past and future. So we conceptualize things as being continuums. For example, me, the self, we see to be a continuum. My mind, we see to be a continuum. But what we experience is a discrete moment of awareness. And that discrete moment of awareness is something that is called lacking in characteristics. Now, it's hard to understand what this means unless you yourself have some meditation. But this presence or discrete moment of awareness is not something that itself includes any specific characteristics. Those characteristics only arise to our mind in dependence upon our notions of past and future, interrelations, this interconnectedness between for example, my likes and my desires. So something will arise to my senses and we think that's beautiful, right? Beauty doesn't exist in that object. It only exists in dependence upon my own kind of history or story, who I am. Certain creatures see certain things to be beautiful. It's not an inherent characteristic of that experience. But it gets much, much more subtle than that, because this present moment that we experience is, in fact, what we call a quantum time moment. So we can think about what a quantum particle is, right? It's kind of like a one-dimensional object. But we find it difficult to understand what a quantum time moment is. So a one-dimensional time moment, let's say, this indivisible time moment, is not something that can exist in a continuum, just in the same way that a discrete one-dimensional particle cannot exist in the context of built-up mass of something, right? So we see this, perceive it to be something solid, but what we understand is, one, it's made out of quantum particles. That means that they're indivisible and they have no sides. Not only that the electrons and the particles that make up this solid object do not exist in a particular state, right? They're called a quantum superposition. So everything that makes up me, everything that makes up a solid object is not determined in any way. Now, the problem with physics is that we assume that this state, this quantum state, has to kind of collapse into conventional reality at some point. That's where we go wrong. In terms of the Buddha Dharma, that's where we go wrong. In terms of the Buddha Dharma, then this object is not something in which these superposition collapse into something definite. It always exists in superposition. What does that mean? Its identity is never fixed. So in terms of our meditation, our perception, then what we experience is this kind of state of possibilities, something that does not exist in a fixed state and that is free of any characteristics. But in order to navigate the mundane world, we build up this kind of fallacy. So how can we kind of think about this in terms of psychology? Well, we walk into a room and the brain becomes very active and it maps out everything in the room, locations. And it kind of compartmentalizes everything. And then once we become kind of familiar with our environment, what we do is we create this kind of 3D map of our environment. All we perceive, as they say, is like a few degrees in the center of our vision. That's all we perceive. And everything else is kind of very indistinct. And really what we do mentally is we kind of create this kind of virtual reality that we experience. And we know this to be the case. This can be tested. It's been, there's a long history of tests to prove this. But you could just be sitting watching TV. Let's say you were watching the Super Bowl yesterday, as I hear most people were doing. And then you think your dog is sitting there next to you, sort of quietly watching the TV. And you're just convinced of that, right? You believe that. Eating whatever you eat, hot dogs and popcorn or drinking a beer. And then you turn and you realize that it's not your dog. It's your jacket where you put it down earlier. So we all experience this kind of illusion that we create. So that's just an analogy. The same thing happens for our momentary perception of reality. And what we actually perceive is the empty nature, characterless nature of all phenomena. But that doesn't help us navigate our mundane lives. We need to systematize things. We need to make this kind of mental map of our environment. Otherwise, we'd be wandering around like a mad person. And that is how enlightened beings appear to us. That's, if you read the stories, then they act in a very strange way. They appear mad to us. It's because they don't have this. They experience things for the way they are. But the analogy that I always use is if you're, let's say, a hunter-gatherer, hundreds of thousands of years ago, and then you're going around picking seeds off the floor of the forest, then unless your mind turned everything into a map and simplified things, then that activity would not be efficient in any way. So we're kind of programmed to do that. Why? In order to navigate conventional reality. So it's necessary in the provisional sense, in the provisional truth. But transcendence, or the ultimate realization, is that which goes beyond this. It doesn't really go beyond anything. It's the way things naturally are. It's about dropping our conceptual fallacy that we normally interact with. Now, we say, well, if I do that, I won't be able to navigate mundane world. So where does this bring us back to? The beginning of this conversation. Where is the start? The mundane world is pointless. There's no point in the mundane world. It will only bring suffering. So in order to realize this unborn reality, first we have to have the renunciation that recognizes that there is no point in the mundane world. And when you have no purpose or use for the mundane world, then you can start to drop the conventionalities that are used in order to navigate samsara. Okay. Not leaving any sentient being behind doesn't mean abandoning them at the bus stop. Yeah, well, that's the first thing that came to my mind. Well, we kind of think that, right? We think, I'm not going to help him. It's not that. It's if I get the chance to liberate them in future, forget it. I'm done with them. Then you've lost your thing. But it's again, you can repair it and you can retake your vows. So there's no problem there. Somebody asked, I think, is Bon Buddhism? What is Bon Buddhism? Okay. So Bon is an animist religion from Tibet. It was the predominant religion in this area. It's kind of very similar to the First Nations, indigenous religions, as they were in North America. I think it's the same root. They have a basic belief in reincarnation, deities and demons. They engage in a lot of blood sacrifice. Initially, they were an animist religion, quite a kind of pagan or tribal religion. And when Buddhism came into Tibet, then Bon adopted a lot of Buddhist principles. And these days, they're almost indistinguishable, except this Bon Buddhism focuses more on the kind of blood rituals and these kind of outer aspects which seem more shamanic. So like Bon Buddhism is basically a shamanic religion. And you will see that Tibetan Buddhism has a lot of attributes of shamanism. And this is the reason, it's something I often talk about. A religion cannot propagate into a new culture without moving in the context or in the framework of that culture. And so unless they adopt these aspects of another culture or religion, then there will be no way for it to propagate. What Buddhism carries with it as it moves from nation to nation is it carries these fundamental or core principles, especially the fundamental kind of philosophical tenet. And in terms of the Mahayana Buddha Dharma, then that's emptiness, right? In terms of the Hinayana, that's this no self and the four truths. But in terms of Vajrayana and the Mahayana, then it's the principle of emptiness. And so this is just kind of wrapped up in these other characteristics. And Bon Buddhism then these days is basically indistinguishable from Buddhism. You can't really say they're not Buddhist because they're Bon, but really, if you're a purist, then Bon is an anti-Buddhist religion because it believes, it's kind of almost theistic, right? It believes in this kind of eternal or pure soul. Somebody described it to me who had a Bon teacher, and you see yourself as a kind of god of light. Right? So the individual is like this soul, this illuminated soul. And so it's kind of inherently non-Buddhist. And then there's a lot of animosity between Bon and Buddhism, especially the purists. So the Bons say, oh, these Tibetans came and stole our religion. And it's something that the pagans, the northern shaman tradition that you get in Europe, also say about Christianity. They say Christianity came in, they stole our solstice celebrations and Easter and all that sort of thing. But what they did is that they took on the attributes, the outer attributes of the culture of that society, but with it brought a different message as a core, a different message. And that's basically the same with Bon and Buddhism. But I mean, like I say, there's a lot of animosity between Buddhists and Bon in Tibet. Of course, most of them are just Bon Buddhists. So they just mix the two up and they don't see them to be any different. But the purists even, I have to say it's great, they even like murder each other. You know, they have death threats going between people. If a Buddhist, let's say a teacher or a monk, says something negative about some of these Bon teachers in Tibet, then they get death threats. So there is a real division there. But anyway, most of the people, same in Nepal, India, they don't really distinguish between Christianity, between Hinduism. We do that in the West, right? We think it's all the same. Hindu, Christianity, it's all the same. Ultimately, that's a mistake. It will cause obstacles on your spiritual path because you won't be able to differentiate between the different levels of view. Provisionally, it's not so much of a problem. Because if you're like the Nepalis, for example, where they just accept everything, you know, they say they're Hindu, they're 75% Hindu, but they will go to a Christian church, they will go to a Buddhist temple, they accept everything. Well, on that kind of low level, it's quite good because they're just basically good people. They don't want to steal, they don't want to kill, they want to behave themselves. And so it's beneficial. But if you want to make significant progress on the spiritual path, then as I always say over and over again, first you got to identify your motive, what you're aiming for, and then based on that, then you have to choose the path that's most efficacious. And for some people, then depending on their goals, then it's better for them to be Christian, or it's better for them to follow the Hindu path, or it's better for them to follow the Buddhist path, you know, if they want that goal. And by mixing it all up, it becomes an obstacle to you eventually achieving your end goal. If you wish to achieve the state of perceptionless samadhi, for example, which is what many Hindu practitioners do, they immerse themselves in a sleep-like state where the sense perceptions disappear inwards and not aware of anything. Then if you're trying to do that, but you're reading teachings saying that this state itself only leads to rebirth and samsara, then it's going to confuse you, right? So you kind of you need to study. You need to know what you're getting yourself into. And also you need to be very clear about your motivation. But I understand this point about motivation is difficult. It's the first thing I ask anybody if they want my advice. And pretty well, I haven't met a single person who had an answer. We're not really clear what we're after. For most of us, we just have this innate sense that things aren't right and we need something else. And actually, that's a really great starting point. That's related to renunciation. Well, your grandmother, a Son practitioner, who would have thought it? Yeah. It's a strange thing in Korea because you've got the family, right? Mother, father, and most of the women are Buddhists. And it's usually the men who are Christians. It's very common in their tradition. The home religion is Buddhism. How did that come about? Well, the story is not very spiritual. It's kind of funny. So we had the Korean War, right? And after the Korean War, then Korea was completely destroyed. I remember traveling as a young child to Korea, and it was just craters everywhere. You know, totally deforested. They destroyed the whole country. The Chinese came right up from the north, all the way down through the entire peninsula, and then the kind of Western Allied forces remained only on this small island called Jeju-do, tiny island 100 miles off the coastline. All of Korea had been ransacked and overrun by war, by millions of Chinese soldiers. And so the whole place was destroyed. And so after the war, they had to rebuild it all. And basically, the American Army were in charge. Nothing happened without them. And as you know, the American Army is highly Baptist, right? So Baptists are kind of, they're Christians, but in general, they're not very accepting of other religions. And so they wouldn't do business with anybody unless they were a Christian. If you were, and it was the men, right? If you were a plumber, a driver, etc. like that, you had to say, I'm a Christian. Otherwise, they wouldn't give you a job. And so what you ended up with is that in the family, then all the men professed Christianity, and the women had the home religion. They would go to the Buddhist temple and make incense offerings and do that sort of thing. So it's quite common. And I wouldn't say my grandmother was a spiritual practitioner. She was just traditionally, a hereditary Buddhist. It's like we're hereditary Christians. If we get a census, we write Christian, but how many of us actually go to church, actually believe in the Bible or study the Bible? So my grandmother never studied it. In fact, my grandfather, who said he was a Catholic, his story is a little bit different. He was educated by Jesuits. So he was kind of, quite a rare few. He became a doctor and he was educated by the Jesuits, so he was a Catholic. Catholics are much fewer than Baptists in Korea. He was more philosophical. He knew a lot more about Buddhism and the Buddhist philosophy than my grandmother did. Blessing to your parents. Thank you. I'll pass that on to them. They will appreciate it. I am someone who is atheist. Is there any point in practice if you can't believe in past and future lives, hell realms, etc.? There's no problem with being an atheist, and there's also no problem with if you don't believe in past and future lives. This belief in past and future lives and karma, cause and effect is taught to be the highest worldly view. And in general, then it is what delineates between a mundane practitioner and a spiritual practitioner. But again, you have to understand what your goal is, right? To be a decent human being, which is the very foundation of all spiritual practice, you don't have to have any religious beliefs. You just have to have kind of humanist beliefs. You do have to avoid the extreme of nihilism. So if you just think everything just happened randomly, nothing has any meaning, then it's going to be very difficult to justify being a good person because there's no morality in that world. So you do need some kind of belief in morality. And then based on that, then to work to be a decent human being. But there are logical ways of coming to that conclusion, right? For example, you go to work, you look around. The person who is always arguing with somebody, it makes the whole environment kind of unpleasant. We're all human beings. We all want to be happy. We all want to be free from suffering. So I shouldn't be the one creating suffering in this circumstance. That is like a starting point. And it's kind of the seed of your future spiritual practice. And in general, then Atisha talked about these three types of religious practitioners, spiritual practitioners. And the first one of those, called the lesser spiritual individual or lesser capable individual, is one who is looking for rebirth in higher realms. So as you can see there, you need this highest worldly view before you can be one of these kind of spiritual practitioners. But for most of us, we miss this point. First, you got to be a decent human being, a decent sentient being, and have love and compassion, consideration and concern for others, not cause troubles, be open-minded and easygoing. And I think that is where we need to leave it today, because it's getting late and I can't spend too much time. The woman who is here to help look after my parents while I do these live streams has got to go in a minute, so I'll leave it at that. But that's why I think we need to leave ourselves, is with this thought. First, to ask ourselves, am I a decent human being? Because if I'm not a decent human being, then how on earth can I become an authentic spiritual practitioner? So as usual, then let's dedicate any merit or benefit that may have arisen from this conversation and try to use it to spread out the love and compassion throughout the universe, and also pray that we may be able to be of help to others. So this virtue that we've accumulated is something that we give away. We don't hang on to it, but we dedicate it to others so that they can be free from unhappiness and find a final liberation and emancipation from the mundane world. And until next time, then see you later.